The First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Contrary to those who want to eliminate religious expression from the public square, these important words were written to protect freedom of religion, not freedom from religion.
The First Amendment, in its religion clause, was established to prohibit the federal government from establishing a national church. It was not a refutation or was not in any way hostile to religion in general, either in public or in private.
Significantly, the 90 founding fathers who framed the First Amendment expressed a very clear intent for that amendment, an intent recorded here in the records of Congress. The debates surrounding the framing of the First Amendment ran from June the 7th through September the 25th of 1789, and the records of those debates make unequivocally clear that the First Amendment's purpose was to limit the federal government in two specific areas. First, the federal government was prohibited from establishing a national denomination, whether Catholic, Anglican, or any other. This was the very problem that America had faced when she was part of Great Britain. The British government could decree an official denomination to which all citizens must belong and then punish those who refused. The founders did not want that in America. The part of the First Amendment that forbids any such national denomination is called the Establishment Clause, and it is the part stating, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Secondly, the First Amendment also prohibited the federal government from interfering with or limiting the people's religious expressions. This part of the First Amendment is called the Free Exercise Clause. It's the part stating or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Through the Free Exercise Clause, the federal government was required to protect and not suppress, as it currently does, public religious expressions. In short, because of the Free Exercise Clause, the federal government could not prohibit the people's free exercise of religion, whether expressed privately or publicly. This is the extent of the First Amendment's religion clauses. And not only does the phrase separation of church and state not appear in any part of that amendment, but significantly, according to the official records of the entire debate on that amendment, the phrase separation of church and state never even came up during the months of discussions over that amendment. Not one single framer ever mentioned that phrase throughout the entire official discussion. It does seem that if separation of church and state had been their great intent for the First Amendment, somebody, one of those 90, surely would have said something about it. But no one did. Not a single word said about it. Neither the word separation, nor church, nor state is found in any part of the First Amendment. In fact, that phrase appears in no governmental founding document. Of course, most today recognize the phrase separation of church and state, but few know its source. Yet it is important to understand the origins of that phrase and how it subsequently became somehow attached to the First Amendment. What then is the origin of the phrase separation of church and state that today so many consider? It's a phrase that appeared in a private letter penned by Thomas Jefferson 13 years after the First Amendment had been written.
Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptists that in modern days has often been misunderstood and really distorted as to its meaning. The Danbury Baptists were concerned that the government was somehow going to interfere with their form of worship. And so they requested the president to write to them and explain to them his views on this aspect of it. And he made it clear when he talked about a separation of church and state, it was to keep government, to keep the state from interfering with religion. It was not to separate the public or public activities from religion, or to keep religion out of the public square. The founders felt that religion was very important and that it should be practiced in the public square. It was just a matter of not preferring one religion over another or prescribing something as the, quote, official, unquote, religion of the federal government.
Jefferson, like the other founders, fully understood that the purpose of the First Amendment was to protect rather than prevent public religious expressions, and that this is what separation of church and state meant. In fact, for almost a century and a half after Jefferson's letter, there was no misunderstanding either about the purpose of the First Amendment or the meaning of Jefferson's phrase. Here's an example. In 1853, half a century after Jefferson had written that phrase, a group petitioned Congress urging them to separate Christian principles from government, with chaplains being turned out of Congress and the military, and Christian principles being removed from government in the official public square. Congress spent a year investigating that possibility and then emphatically rejected it, declaring,
"Had the people, the Founding Fathers, during the Revolution had a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one denomination."
In short, there was no way Congress was going to use the First Amendment and consequently its so-called separation of church and state to secularize the public square. However, it was not just Congress that refused to do so. The Supreme Court refused to do so as well. In an 1878 case, more than 3/4 of a century after Jefferson had penned his separation letter, the plaintiffs in that case invoked his separation of church and state phrase, hoping to use it to their advantage. However, that Supreme Court was not content to let them get by with just using the 8-word separation phrase out of context from Jefferson's letter, which, by the way, is what courts today do. No, rather than just cite the single phrase, the Supreme Court reprinted a lengthy segment from Jefferson's letter to prove the separation of church and state was intended to protect rather than remove Christian values and practices from public policy. The courts maintained that position for the next 7 decades. Then, in 1947, a radical change occurred. In the case Everson versus Board of Education, the court cited only Jefferson's separation metaphor, ignoring the rest of his letter and its clear context. It therefore boldly announced a new policy.
The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach.
This was a brand new philosophy for the court. No longer would Jefferson's separation phrase protect public religious expressions, as it had for the previous century and a half. It would now become a mandate to exclude religious expressions and to secularize the public square. The courts have now elevated a single phrase from a private letter, a phrase completely reversed from its original meaning, above the actual language of the First Amendment itself. The Supreme Court, having announced its new approach in 1947, first nationally implemented the policy of public secularism in 1962 when, for the first time in American history, it ordered the separation of religious principles from education, ruling that it was unconstitutional for a student to pray voluntarily, to say a voluntary prayer at school. So revolutionary was this decision that the following year, even the court itself acknowledged that this decision had been without precedent. In the landmark 1962 case, the court achieved its reversal of the Constitution's protection for religious expressions first by using the phrase separation of church and state without regard to its historical meaning, and then by redefining the meaning of a single word within the separation phrase, the word church. In 1962, the court decided that the word church would no longer mean a religious institution, it would now mean a religious activity. So instead of the First Amendment being used to prevent the federal government from setting up a national denomination, which voluntary prayer certainly did not do, it now meant that the federal government must not allow a public religious activity, which voluntary prayer certainly was. This was the turning point in the modern interpretation of the First Amendment. Following those two landmark rulings, courts continued to expand the new secular mandates outward. This trend of hostility toward religious expressions continued in case after case, year after year.